at 4:17 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning, satellite imagery confirmed what military analysts had been tracking for the past 72 hours. The Kerch Strait Bridge, the $15 billion lifeline connecting mainland Russia to occupied Crimea, sustained catastrophic damage that has severed Vladimir Putin's most critical supply artery into the peninsula. What happened next reveals the terminal fragility of Russia's position in a territory it has held for a decade. The bridge is gone, not damaged, not temporarily closed, structurally compromised to the point where military logistics experts are now calculating timelines measured in months, not weeks, for any restoration of full operational capacity. This is not another incremental setback in a grinding war of attrition. This is a strategic amputation that fundamentally alters the military balance in the Black Sea region and exposes the Russian military to a supply crisis it cannot solve through improvisation. Here is what you need to understand about what just happened. The Kerch Bridge represented far more than a transportation link. It was Putin's physical manifestation of permanent occupation, the concrete and steel declaration that Crimea would remain Russian territory regardless of international law or Ukrainian resistance. Opened in 2018 at a cost exceeding $15 billion, the bridge stretched 19 kilometers across the Kerch Strait, carrying both road and rail traffic that sustained Russian military operations across southern Ukraine. Every tank, every artillery shell, every soldier rotation into the theater depended on this single choke point. The bridge carried approximately 14,000 vehicles daily and moved an estimated 15 million tons of cargo annually. Military supplies moving south, wounded personnel evacuating north, fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement equipment. All of it funneled through this one structure because the alternative routes through occupied Ukrainian territory have become increasingly untenable as Ukrainian long-range strike capabilities have expanded. Make sure you are subscribed to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell, because what I am about to reveal about Russia's logistical alternatives will show you exactly why this bridge failure creates an irreversible crisis that Putin cannot solve. The damage assessment tells the story. The road bridge sustained multiple strike points across both eastbound and westbound spans. Structural engineers examining the satellite imagery identify at least 4 separate impact locations where the concrete decking has collapsed completely, creating gaps measuring between 40 and 70 meters. The rail bridge, which carried the heaviest military cargo, including tanks and armored vehicles, shows catastrophic damage to at least 2 support pylons, rendering that section completely unusable until full reconstruction occurs. This was not a superficial attack designed to create temporary disruption. This was a systematic targeting operation designed to inflict damage that would require months of engineering work to repair. Each impact point was selected to maximize structural failure while minimizing the possibility of rapid field repairs. You cannot bridge a 70-meter gap with temporary military pontoons. You cannot reroute rail traffic around collapsed support pylons. This requires industrial-scale reconstruction with specialized equipment, materials, and time that Russia does not have. The timing is what makes this development truly extraordinary. Russia currently maintains approximately 120,000 troops in occupied Crimea and southern Ukraine, forces that require approximately 3,000 tons of supplies daily to maintain operational readiness. Those supplies include fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and replacement equipment. Before this bridge failure, approximately 70% of that supply tonnage moved across the Kerch Bridge. The remaining 30% came through the land corridor along the Sea of Azov coast through occupied Ukrainian territory. That land corridor has become progressively less viable as Ukrainian forces have pushed their front lines closer to the logistics routes, and Ukrainian long-range strike systems have reached deeper into occupied territory. High-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, operating from Ukrainian-controlled territory, can now reach key segments of that coastal highway. Ukrainian Storm Shadow cruise missiles and Neptune anti-ship missiles adapted for land attack have struck supply depots and rail junctions throughout the corridor. The bridge was not just preferred logistics route. It was the only logistics route that Russia could protect with any confidence. Now consider what happens when you sever that route. 120,000 troops requiring 3,000 tons of supplies daily. 70% of that tonnage, or approximately 2,100 tons, previously moved across the bridge. That supply stream has been eliminated. The land corridor, already operating at reduced capacity due to Ukrainian interdiction, must now carry the entire burden. Military logistics specialists calculate that the corridor can handle at most 1,200 tons daily under current threat conditions. This creates a supply deficit of approximately 1,800 tons per day. What does an 1,800-ton daily supply deficit look like in practice? It means Russian forces begin rationing ammunition within 48 hours. Artillery units that were firing 60 rounds per gun per day reduced to 20 rounds per gun per day. Tank units that were conducting offensive operations shift to defensive posture to conserve fuel and ammunition. Infantry units that were rotating from frontline positions every 14 days extend their deployments to 21 or 28 days because replacement units cannot move forward through the constricted supply lines. Within 1 week, the ammunition shortage becomes critical. Russian artillery, which has maintained overwhelming volume advantage throughout this conflict, loses that advantage as stockpiles at forward positions are exhausted faster than they can be replenished. Ukrainian forces, operating with Western-supplied ammunition that arrives through multiple secure logistics routes, maintain their firing rates while Russian guns fall silent. The fundamental equation of artillery warfare reverses. Within 2 weeks, the fuel shortage forces operational changes. Russian armor, which has relied on mass and mobility to compensate for inferior tactics and training, becomes immobilized. Tanks that were conducting counterattacks and exploitation maneuvers park in defensive positions because the fuel to move them no longer exists. Helicopters that were providing close air support and medical evacuation reduce flight hours by 60%. Transport aircraft that were shuttling supplies into Crimean airfields decrease their missions because the fuel stocks at those airfields are being reserved for combat aircraft. Within 3 weeks, the spare parts shortage begins degrading equipment readiness. Artillery systems that break down cannot be repaired because replacement parts are stuck in mainland Russia. Armored vehicles that throw tracks or blow engines become permanent losses. Electronic warfare systems that malfunction go offline. Command and control networks that depend on regular maintenance begin experiencing increasing outages. The Russian military, already struggling with equipment maintenance due to sanctions and Western export controls, sees its operational readiness collapse as the supply pipeline constricts. This is not a temporary disruption that Russian logistics personnel can solve through improvisation and redistribution. This is a mathematical certainty. The supply requirements exceed the transportation capacity, and that gap widens each day as stockpiles in Crimea are consumed without adequate replenishment. Military analysts watching this situation unfold are using a specific term to describe what is happening: logistical strangulation. But here is where it gets truly extraordinary. Putin's only alternative to accepting this logistical collapse is to attempt a massive airlift operation, flying supplies into Crimea using military transport aircraft. Russian military aviation possesses approximately 100 operational Il-76 heavy transport aircraft, each capable of carrying approximately 40 tons of cargo. Operating at maximum tempo with multiple sorties per day, those aircraft could theoretically move approximately 8,000 tons of supplies daily into Crimean airfields. The problem is that Ukrainian air defenses have made Crimean airspace among the most dangerous in the world for Russian aviation. Ukraine operates S-300 air defense systems captured from Russian forces, supplemented by Western-supplied NASAMS and IRIS-T systems that create overlapping coverage across the approaches to Crimea. Ukrainian forces have already demonstrated their ability to strike targets deep inside Crimea, including Russian naval facilities and airfields. Any Russian airlift operation flying regular routes into predictable locations would be presenting Ukrainian air defense operators with target-rich environments. Russia attempted this exact scenario in the opening months of the invasion when it tried to supply isolated forces at Hostomel Airport near Kiev. Ukrainian air defenses destroyed multiple Il-76 aircraft, with at least one confirmed loss of an aircraft carrying approximately 100 paratroopers. Each Il-76 cost approximately $100 million when accounting for modifications and equipment. Each lost aircraft represents approximately 3% of Russia's entire heavy transport fleet. Each lost crew represents years of training and experience that cannot be quickly replaced. The mathematics of an airlift operation under contested airspace conditions is catastrophic for the attacking force. So Putin faces a genuine strategic dilemma with no good options. He can attempt the airlift and accept aircraft losses that will cripple Russian military aviation's long-term capacity. He can reduce force levels in Crimea and southern Ukraine, withdrawing troops to positions that can be sustained through the land corridor alone. He can attempt to negotiate with Ukraine from a position of increasing weakness as his forces in the region become progressively less combat capable. Or he can watch his military presence in Crimea slowly suffocate as supplies run out and equipment degrades. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris and turn on notifications right now, because what I'm about to tell you about Ukraine's next moves and Russia's internal political fractures will show you exactly how this crisis escalates in ways that threaten Putin's control over the entire war effort. The Ukrainian military command has been planning for this exact scenario for months. Western intelligence agencies, working with Ukrainian general staff, identified the Kerch Bridge as the single most valuable strategic target in the entire theater. Taking down the bridge does not just create a logistics crisis for Russian forces in Crimea. It fundamentally alters the strategic calculus for the entire southern front and potentially the war's ultimate outcome. Ukrainian forces are now positioned to exploit the supply crisis in multiple ways simultaneously. First, they can increase pressure along the land corridor, forcing Russia to divert additional resources to protect the one remaining supply line, while that line becomes progressively more vulnerable. Ukrainian special operations forces operating behind Russian lines can target bridges, rail junctions, and supply depots along the corridor, creating cascading failures that further constrict Russian logistics. Second, Ukrainian forces can intensify their strikes against Russian positions in southern Ukraine, knowing that Russian units are now operating with degraded supply lines and cannot sustain extended engagements. Artillery duels that Russia previously won through sheer volume advantage now favor Ukraine as Russian ammunition stockpiles dwindle. Ukrainian mechanized units can probe Russian defensive lines, forcing Russians to expend ammunition and fuel responding to threats, while Ukrainian forces retain the option to break contact before sustaining serious losses. Third, Ukraine can target Russian logistics hubs and transportation infrastructure throughout Crimea itself, compounding the supply crisis by destroying the stockpiles that remain on the peninsula. Ukrainian Neptune missiles have demonstrated the ability to strike targets throughout Crimea. Storm Shadow cruise missiles provided by the United Kingdom can reach even the most distant Russian facilities. Each successful strike against a fuel depot or ammunition stockpile represents weeks of supplies lost, weeks that Russia cannot replace through the constricted logistics pipeline. The psychological impact of this development on Russian forces cannot be overstated. Soldiers operating in forward positions now understand that the supplies they need to survive and fight effectively are not coming. Commanders at every level now understand that the operational plans they were ordered to execute are no longer feasible because the logistics to support those plans no longer exist. Officers who have spent months building defensive positions now realize those positions may become untenable, not because Ukrainian forces overwhelm them, but because the supplies to hold them run out. This creates a morale crisis that compounds the material crisis. Soldiers who believe they are fighting a winnable war will endure extraordinary hardship and danger. Soldiers who believe they have been abandoned in an untenable position begin looking for ways to survive rather than ways to fight. Russian military history includes multiple examples of formations that maintained cohesion under horrific conditions when supplied and supported, and multiple examples of those same formations collapsing when cut off from logistics. The psychology of isolated forces running out of supplies tends strongly toward disintegration. Putin's domestic political situation makes this crisis particularly dangerous. He has built his entire presidency on projecting strength and competence, on the narrative that Russia under his leadership has reclaimed its position as a great power that cannot be challenged or humiliated by the West. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was the cornerstone of that narrative, the demonstration that Russia could seize territory and hold it regardless of international condemnation. Now that cornerstone is cracking. The bridge that was supposed to symbolize permanent Russian control has been severed. The military forces that were supposed to defend Crimea are being slowly strangled by supply failures. The narrative of Russian military competence and strategic acumen is being replaced by imagery of Russian forces isolated and vulnerable because their logistics were dependent on a single bridge that Ukraine could destroy. The Russian nationalist political coalition that has supported Putin throughout this war is beginning to fracture. Hardline military bloggers, who have served as informal mouthpieces for Russian military leadership, are openly questioning the strategic planning that left Russian forces in Crimea dependent on a single logistics choke point. Opposition figures, even those who generally support the war, are asking why Russia did not build redundant supply routes or develop alternatives to the bridge before Ukraine developed the capability to destroy it. This is not a typical wartime setback that Putin can blame on subordinates or external factors. This is a failure of strategic planning at the highest levels, a failure that exposes Russian forces to an escalating crisis that has no simple solution. The political pressure on Putin to either solve this crisis or accept a strategic defeat in Crimea is building in ways that limit his options and force him toward decisions he has avoided for months. The international dimension adds additional complexity. Turkey controls the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and has closed those straits to warships under the Montreux Convention provisions regarding wartime restrictions. Russia cannot reinforce its Black Sea fleet with vessels from other theaters. Russian naval power in the Black Sea is whatever vessels were present when Turkey closed the straits, minus whatever losses Russia has sustained to Ukrainian attacks. This matters because any Russian attempt to establish a naval supply route to Crimea would require using the Black Sea Fleet to protect transport vessels carrying supplies. But the Black Sea Fleet has already proven vulnerable to Ukrainian anti-ship missiles, with the flagship Moskva sunk and multiple other vessels damaged or destroyed. Using the remaining fleet assets to protect slow-moving transport vessels would expose those assets to Ukrainian strikes, while simultaneously removing them from their normal missions, protecting the Syrian supply route and projecting Russian power in the eastern Mediterranean. NATO member states are watching this development with particular interest. The degradation of Russian military capabilities in Crimea and southern Ukraine has direct implications for NATO's security posture along its eastern flank. Russian forces tied down in Ukraine and struggling with supply failures are forces that cannot threaten the Baltics or pressure Poland. Russian military equipment consumed in Ukraine is equipment that will not be available for other operations. Russian logistics failures in Crimea demonstrate systemic weaknesses in Russian military planning and execution that inform NATO threat assessments. Several NATO members have already indicated they are prepared to increase military support to Ukraine, specifically to exploit the Kerch Bridge failure. Additional long-range strike systems, additional air defense platforms, additional artillery ammunition, additional intelligence and targeting support. The Western coalition supporting Ukraine sees this moment as a potential turning point, an opportunity to inflict a strategic defeat on Russian forces that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of the conflict. The economic implications extend beyond purely military considerations. Russia's economy is already under severe stress from Western sanctions, from the costs of mobilization and war production, from the diversion of resources away from productive economic activity and toward military operations. The Kerch Bridge served civilian economic functions as well as military ones, facilitating trade and transportation between Crimea and mainland Russia. The bridge's destruction disrupts that economic activity, imposing additional costs on an economy already operating under extraordinary strain. Crimea's economy specifically has become almost entirely dependent on Russian subsidies since the 2014 annexation. The peninsula produces little of economic value and relies on Russian government transfers to maintain basic services and infrastructure. Those transfers become progressively more difficult to sustain as Russian government revenues decline due to falling energy exports and increasing war costs. The bridge failure compounds this economic isolation by making even the transfer of subsidies more difficult and expensive. Russian officials are publicly claiming that repairs to the bridge will be completed within months and that alternative supply routes are functioning normally. These claims are contradicted by the physical evidence of the damage, by the mathematical realities of logistics capacity, and by the reports coming from Russian military personnel in Crimea through intercepted communications and social media posts. The gap between official Russian statements and observable reality is widening in ways that undermine the regime's credibility, even with domestic audiences generally supportive of the war. Ukrainian officials have been more direct in their assessments. President Volodymyr Zelensky has called the bridge failure a turning point in the war for southern Ukraine. Ukrainian defense officials have stated explicitly that Russian forces in Crimea are now in an untenable position, and that Ukraine intends to exploit this opportunity to liberate occupied territory. Western military analysts consulted by major news organizations have confirmed that Russian logistics in the region have been severely degraded and that the supply deficit cannot be solved through improvisational measures. Here's what happens next. Over the next 48 to 72 hours, Russian commanders in Crimea will be conducting emergency assessments of their supply stockpiles and making decisions about force posture and operations based on those assessments. Units with sufficient stockpiles to continue operations for weeks will maintain their current positions. Units with critically low stockpiles will withdraw to positions closer to supply nodes. The overall Russian defensive perimeter in southern Ukraine will contract as forces redistribute to positions that can be sustained through the constricted logistics pipeline. Ukrainian forces will probe this contracting perimeter, looking for opportunities to exploit the chaos and confusion that accompanies large-scale logistics failures. Small unit actions designed to force Russian units to expend ammunition and fuel. Artillery bombardments targeting Russian positions that can no longer effectively return fire due to ammunition shortages. Drone strikes against Russian logistics convoys attempting to move supplies through the land corridor. Each action designed to compound the crisis and accelerate the deterioration of Russian combat capability. Within 1 week to 10 days, the first reports of major Russian equipment losses due to fuel shortages will emerge. Tanks abandoned because they cannot be moved. Artillery pieces captured because their crews withdrew without sufficient transport to take the guns with them. Helicopters grounded because the fuel to fly them no longer exists. These are not battlefield losses inflicted by Ukrainian fire. These are logistics losses, equipment sacrificed, because the supplies to operate and sustain it are not available. Within 2 to 3 weeks, Russian command will face the decision it has been avoiding since this crisis began. Either commit to the airlift operation with all its risks and costs, or begin planning for a large-scale withdrawal from positions that cannot be sustained. This decision will not be made at the tactical or operational level. This decision will be made by Vladimir Putin personally, because the political implications of either choice are too significant to delegate. If Putin chooses the airlift, Ukrainian air defenses will be waiting. Every transport aircraft lost represents not just the immediate material cost, but the long-term degradation of Russian military aviation capability. If Putin chooses withdrawal, he acknowledges that Ukrainian resistance has forced Russia to surrender territory it claimed to have permanently annexed. Either choice represents a strategic defeat with profound political implications. The historical parallels to this moment are striking. In 1944, German forces in Crimea were similarly cut off from reliable supply lines and faced similar choices about whether to maintain untenable positions or withdraw. The German command chose to evacuate by sea, losing approximately 30,000 troops in the process. In 1942, German forces at Stalingrad were surrounded and cut off from supply, with the Luftwaffe attempting an airlift operation that failed catastrophically. The Stalingrad garrison ultimately surrendered after months of slow starvation and decline. Russia's situation in Crimea in 2024 shares elements of both precedents. The forces are not yet fully surrounded, as the land corridor remains nominally open. But the logistics situation is progressively deteriorating in ways that will ultimately produce the same outcome as complete encirclement, if not reversed. The airlift option exists but carries catastrophic risks. The withdrawal option exists but carries catastrophic political costs. Putin, like commanders in those historical precedents, must choose between unacceptable alternatives. What makes this moment particularly consequential is that the Kerch Bridge failure occurs at a point where Russian strategic reserves are already depleted, where Russian military production cannot replace losses fast enough, where Russian economic resources are stretched to their limits, and where Russian political cohesion is beginning to fracture under the accumulated stress of a war that was supposed to be quick and decisive, but has become grinding and endless. The bridge is gone. Putin's forces in Crimea are beginning to run out of supplies. Ukraine is positioning to exploit this crisis in ways that could fundamentally alter the map of occupied territory. Western support for Ukraine is increasing precisely at the moment when Russian capabilities are declining. The next 2 to 3 weeks will reveal whether Russia can stabilize this crisis or whether this becomes the inflection point where the war's trajectory definitively turns against Russian interests. The clock is running. Russian ammunition stockpiles in Crimea are being consumed every day. Ukrainian strike capabilities are improving every week. Western intelligence and logistics support is flowing to Ukrainian forces faster than Russian improvisations can compensate. Putin's strategic dilemma has no good solutions, only choices between various forms of defeat that differ in scope and timing. Make no mistake about what is being decided right now. This is not another tactical adjustment in a long war of attrition. This is a strategic crisis that exposes the fundamental weaknesses in Russia's entire approach to this conflict. The overextension of forces beyond sustainable logistics, the dependence on single points of failure for critical supply routes, the inability to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions, the widening gap between official claims of success and the observable reality of accumulating failures. What happens next depends on decisions being made in Moscow and Kiev over the next several days. Will Putin commit to the airlift operation despite its costs? Will he order a withdrawal from positions that cannot be held? Will Ukrainian forces maintain pressure or pause to consolidate gains? Will Western nations provide the additional support Ukraine needs to fully exploit this opportunity? These are the questions that will determine not just the immediate battle for Crimea, but potentially the ultimate outcome of this entire war. The Kerch Bridge was supposed to be Putin's monument to Russian permanence in Crimea, the physical manifestation of annexation that could never be reversed. Instead, it has become his greatest vulnerability, the single point of failure that has exposed his forces to a logistics crisis they cannot solve and a strategic defeat they cannot avoid. The bridge is gone. What comes next will be decisive.